and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Zara Seidler.
I'm Sam Koslowski.
Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro is in a New York detention center after US President Donald Trump ordered a raid to capture the South American leader and take control of the country. It followed an intense bombardment of Venezuela's capital, Caracas, by US forces over the weekend. Trump has said the US will run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper and judicious transition. And so, in the wake of that, today, Sam, we're breaking down what has actually happened in Venezuela, why the US took this extraordinary action, and what it means for the country's future.
Zara, it didn't take long in 2026 before we had our first real major international news event of the year.
Yeah.
Take me through what actually happened over the weekend.
Yeah, so on Saturday, President Trump announced that the US had carried out what he called a large-scale strike against Venezuela. Now, it was really interesting watching this information unfold because so much of Venezuela's media is state-run. So a lot of journalists, ourselves included, were getting most of our information from Twitter, from people who were on the ground, who were uploading videos, and it showed basically just mass bombing across the country's capital.
Middle of the night,
2 a.m.
A black scene, and then these kind of fireballs across much of metropolitan Caracas.
Yeah, exactly. And it took a few hours for President Trump to front up and say what had actually happened. It was pretty clear from the outset that it was the US, but it was only when Donald Trump confirmed it first on Truth Social, and then he delivered a press conference that we fully understood the scope of this operation. He confirmed that the operation involved 150 aircraft and lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. During that operation, most significantly, the US captured Nicolas Maduro and his wife. Now, as I just said, Nicolas Maduro is the country's president.
Yep.
And so we basically, for the first time, learnt this when Donald Trump posted a photo of him on an aircraft, on a US aircraft. He was handcuffed and he was wearing an eye mask. And that's when we learnt that this leader had been captured.
And just to sit on that word captured, you mean they actually, a SWAT team dropped into
His
the
home.
Presidential compound, his home, and captured the president and his wife.
Correct. And they were transported via helicopter to a US Navy ship offshore before they were flown to New York. And as we speak, he's being held in a New York detention center, being indicted on various federal charges, including narco-terrorism conspiracy.
And by narco-terrorism, that means basically a state-sanctioned supply and distribution of drugs,
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Okay, so this is part of Donald Trump's kind of war on drugs, is prosecuting the leader of what he believes to be a kind of country-run drug syndicate.
Yeah.
It's pretty unprecedented. And
I'd say so.
it's really a super dramatic
Very
series of
remarkable.
events.
Yeah.
Before we get into the why behind all of this, give me a sense of who Nicolas Maduro is.
Well, I think that ties very closely into the why behind this. So just to take it back, Nicolas Maduro became the president of Venezuela in 2013.
So 12, 13 years ago.
Yep, after his predecessor, Hugo Chavez, was diagnosed with cancer. So basically, Chavez was the head of this very big movement of change in Venezuela. And when he was diagnosed, he got up and said, basically, I want Nicolas Maduro to replace me.
Got it.
So Nicolas Maduro is a member of the United Socialist Party. And I do just want to say, I think part of the challenge of people trying to understand what is happening right now in Venezuela is that it doesn't necessarily fit into left-right binaries that a lot of people would perhaps traditionally use to understand politics or stories. Nicolas Maduro is arguably on the far left. He is part of a socialist party. But as we'll come to speak about, he has been accused of running a dictatorship by both his political opponents, but more broadly by a lot of world leaders.
Sure.
Between 2012 and 2020, just to give you a sense of Venezuela as a country under Maduro, between those years, Venezuela's economy shrank 71%.
Right.
Under his leadership, millions of Venezuelans have entered poverty. More than 7.7 million people have fled the country. There are more Venezuelan refugees than from any other country around the world. I think a lot of people don't fully appreciate that more Venezuelans have had to leave their homes in recent years than from any other country. And there's been a very violent crackdown on political dissent in the country. So any opposition to Maduro has been met with quite a violent crackdown.
And so then that all kind of unfolds between, as you said, 2012 and 2020. It takes us right up until the 2024 elections.
Yeah.
What happened there? That was just now 18 months ago.
Yeah.
Talk me through that.
Yeah, so ahead of the 2024 elections, Maduro banned his opponent, Maria Corina Machado, from running as a candidate. Now, you might remember her name. It might be familiar to you because she was recently awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. When she was banned from running, a man named Edmundo Gonzalez, who's a former diplomat, was chosen by the opposition to be the candidate that would replace her. Right. And so he ran against Maduro in the 2024 election. Now, Maduro was formally declared the winner of that election. However, Gonzalez was very widely considered to be the legitimate winner. And since the election, both international election analysts and internal opposition parties have accused Maduro of stealing the election. There have been mass protests across the country. We understand that the government at the time arrested up to 2,000 people who were involved in those protests, and that number included a lot of minors.
And one of the loudest critics of that 2024 election result was US President Trump and his administration.
Yeah.
They've been critical of Maduro for a while. It really kind of became louder in that election period.
Yeah.
What is the relationship like between the US and Venezuela?
Well, not great now.
No.
But
a bit tense.
Yeah. But as you said, the US didn't recognize the results of the 2024 election. They didn't recognize Maduro as the president of Venezuela. Neither did a whole host of other Western nations. I'm pretty sure Australia was among them. And so I guess that is the setting of the relationship between the two. And then more recently, over the past few months, the Trump administration has been repeatedly criticizing Maduro over what it calls his involvement in shipping drugs to the US. As we spoke a bit about before, Trump has labeled Maduro a narco-terrorist. And then it kind of all culminated more recently when the US ramped up pressure with a massive military buildup in the Caribbean and a series of deadly missile attacks on these alleged drug-running boats. And so most of the headlines, I guess, that we'd seen before the new year had been about these attacks on these vessels that were traveling from Venezuela.
And so the US conducts missile strikes on boats in the middle of the Caribbean that they say carries drugs. They're Venezuelan boats that Venezuela says are actually carrying oil.
Yeah.
Then we kind of get to this point where there's this military buildup, and that leads us all the way to Saturday.
Yeah.
President Trump gets up and says, we are essentially taking control of Venezuela.
Yep.
Break that down for me, because that's a very big statement.
Hello, Billy here from TDA. We have just looked at our YouTube analytics and 95% of you who are watching our videos aren't subscribing. If you want to help independent media like us grow, the best way you can do that is by pressing subscribe. Thank you so much, and back to the video.
It is a very big statement. So the sequence of events was first there were these attacks on the nation's capital. Shortly afterwards, we get confirmation from Donald Trump that Maduro has been captured, and then he holds a press conference. And it's in that press conference that he announces that the US will run Venezuela until there is what he calls a peaceful transition of power. He said at the time that the US is not afraid of boots on the ground.
Yeah.
It is important, though, to note here that US forces have no control over the country, and Maduro's government has publicly indicated that it will not cooperate with the US. So how the US intends to run it, or who will run it, or how it will be run, that all remains to be seen, basically, at this point.
It's a really interesting difference between what happened over the weekend in Venezuela and what happened 20 years ago in Afghanistan and Iraq, where the transition of power and the capture of a leader and all that kind of stuff happened with US boots on the ground.
Yeah.
The US doesn't even have an embassy in Venezuela. So it really is a different makeup. And it kind of leads to the question of who actually is in charge right now.
Yeah, I mean, there is a short-term answer to that, I guess a very literal answer to who is in power right now, and that is Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez. She's assumed the position of interim president. She was sworn in by a court. She's publicly called on the US to release Maduro and his wife. And so I guess the question, as I just said, that remains is, has there actually been a change in the leadership of Venezuela, or are they now just handing the baton to basically Maduro's successor?
Yeah.
I did speak to somebody who is on the ground in Venezuela about what it's like for Venezuelans there right now, quite literally, walking around what it looks like, because I think it's one thing for us to be talking about it here in Australia.
Yeah.
It's another thing to be over there and having witnessed what is happening and how people are feeling. I'm going to throw to a quick grab.
The vibe on the ground in Caracas over the weekend was one of sort of stunned silence, maybe mixed with a sense of cautious optimism. On the silence front, I think that there had been talk, especially from the Trump administration, for many months now, or weeks at least, of a build-up of military aggression in the area. I didn't get the sense in the couple of weeks that I spent in the capital that anyone was taking that really seriously. The roads were packed in the lead up to Christmas. And now I think the most startling thing is that they're completely empty. We saw a couple of cars passing the street that we've been staying on, mainly going in search of food or gas from the gas stations. Long lines for both grocery stores and gas, but nothing like the sort of COVID scenes that you saw in Australia with panic buying toilet paper and the like. Most people are just sort of hanging out at home and waiting to see where this leads.
So, Zara, I don't think we can have a conversation about Venezuela without talking about oil. It's something that Trump has talked about a lot, and I think it's an important part of this story.
Yeah.
Give me a quick breakdown on the role that oil plays in Venezuela's economy and global trade, but also what happens to all the oil now.
Yeah, so Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves.
So let's sit on that for a sec.
It's a huge thing to
the world's largest oil reserves.
Yeah, and Trump has made no secret of the fact that this is part of his plan, is to tap into those reserves. Because Venezuela, we spoke about how the country's economy has shrunk some 70%. There was a time where Venezuela was the richest country in South America.
Right.
That was largely due to the oil that it has access to. And so Donald Trump has made very clear that US oil companies will move back into Venezuela and basically work on these oil reserves and start to profit from them once again. And he suggested that that money will then be used to rebuild Venezuela, rebuild the country, which is in tatters at the moment. He said, we're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars and fix the badly broken infrastructure.
A really interesting kind of economic lens to put on this, but also it means that for us in Australia, we may see changes in petrol prices over the next couple of months, depending on what happens. Let's talk now, though, about that global response. Give me a sense of first how other world leaders have responded to this.
It's been a bit mixed. I guess I'll start with the UN. We had Secretary General Antonio Guterres describe what had been done as a dangerous precedent, i.e. the US going in and capturing a leader. The UN Security Council met on Monday to discuss what had happened. But if we look at world leaders more generally, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said Australia continues to support international law and a peaceful democratic transition in Venezuela that reflects the will of Venezuelan people. We had French President Emmanuel Macron express hope that González, who I said was that opposition leader who, by all indications, should have won the election. Macron said that he hopes that González will be able to run Venezuela.
Right.
So he was essentially saying now there should be a change of power.
Right.
We had the Spanish PM Pedro Sanchez say that Spain doesn't recognize the Maduro regime, but equally won't recognize an intervention, the US intervention, that it says violates international law.
Really interesting. Kind of a stalemate there.
Yeah, exactly. And then we had the Chinese Foreign Ministry condemn the move, saying that China's deeply shocked and that it condemns the use of force by the US against a sovereign country. So I chose those just to show the array of responses. Venezuela itself is, an ally of Iran, of Russia, of China, exactly. So that gives you a bit of a sense of its geopolitical standing.
Wow, this is a really complicated story. I think it's going to take a couple of explainers to really break down some various aspects to all of this. Where does this leave us now, though? And give us a sense as newsreaders of what we should be looking out for this week in this developing international story.
So the thing to look out for is Maduro appearing in court for the first time. So that's happening. Beyond that, I guess the thing to look at is what does 100 days from now look like?
Sure.
What does even 50 days from now look like? There's so much uncertainty, and everyone who I've spoken to who is in Venezuela now, they are kind of oscillating between all of these different emotions because it is so unclear. Will there just be a continuation of Maduro's power? Will there be a significant regime change? Will the US end up putting boots on the ground? We don't really have any answers to these questions.
Yeah.
And so right now it's too early to say what happens now. I think another question is about international law and whether or not Donald Trump has violated that international law. So I think that's something that the world courts will be looking at. But right now, lots of questions, not many answers.
Well, I think it's our job to start building some of those gaps with us all together. You know, some background in Venezuela could be helpful. Let's talk about oil at some point as well. Zara, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us for the second episode back this year. We'll be back later this afternoon with the day's headlines. But until then, have a wonderful day.